Okay, so we're still talking about musical building blocks. This is really part 2, second lecture, but part 2B, so the second part of the second lecture. And I'm hoping you just watched the YouTube video that talks about overtones and really, I think, makes it pretty clear that when we talk about these theories of why we perceive consonance or dissonance, and we're talking about harmonicity and beating and roughness, that it's all really confounded. I'm going to talk about that a bit more. And one thing you'll notice about me, so here's the outline of where we are now, if we're still in the middle of sensory consonance and dissonance. One thing you might notice about me as we move forward is that any point where that was kind of sticky for me in my understanding is where I try to explain things maybe ad nauseum, because I felt it was kind of confusing. And so if you get a basic general gist of all this, feel good. You don't have to remember any numbers or any math. Just feel good if you can understand some relationship between harmonicity, the overlap or alignment of those harmonics, and the concept of beating and roughness. Okay, so here again, just really giving us the outline and putting us back where we were of talking about why we perceive consonance or dissonance and these theories of harmonics and overlap, the aligning of those harmonics, beating and roughness, and then of course experience and enculturation, which has more to do with musical consonance and dissonance than sensory consonance and dissonance per se, although those two things are very confounded because of the way we create music is influenced by our sensory consonance and dissonance. So very difficult to disentangle those things. But I'm going to move on and talk about beating and roughness at this point. Okay, so I've thought about how to describe this in a number of ways, and I'm hoping that this makes as much sense as I'm saying it out loud as it does in my head. I'm using, so the two figures kind of smushed together there in the middle and then to the bottom right. Those are, I'm hoping, helpful. So the first one in the middle there is showing, and these are pretend harmonics. If you want to take the A at 440, 880, 1320, as we see on the next one over to the right, we can pretend these look more like that. But if we're looking at the harmonics for a particular complex tone, so not a chord, not talking about consonance and dissonance, but just the harmonics for a complex tone, we can see that for a 200 hertz tone, we have the harmonics 200, 400, 600, 800, 1000, and so on, all multiples of 200. Same for the bassoon, same for the alto sax. So if those are all playing that particular note, they're playing the same note, they're going to have similar harmonics, just with differences in the amplitudes or the loudnesses of those different harmonics. And of course, the lower harmonics, as that YouTube video was just saying, are more perceptible or louder. And as you get up into those higher harmonics, we lose. They get softer and softer. So what's being shown at the bottom right is the reaction, the response at the level of the basilar membrane. This is why I wanted to describe what was happening in the ear earlier. What's happening at the level of the basilar membrane is it is vibrating, kind of like a piano keyboard, except it's a membrane, okay? And it's going to be the wave where we see the maximal displacement is going to be for a tone that is at 440 hertz, a complex tone. It's going to have other harmonics, 880, 1320, and so those kind of complex waves are going to be occurring at the level of the basilar membrane. So now we're adding a chord, right? We're playing two tones at the same time. And are they going to sound consonant or dissonant? Well, as I mentioned, it has to do with the harmonics, but part of this, and you can see why these are so these are so confounded as well, although they are different reasonings for what's happening. Part of this is that if we have if we have aligned harmonics, then the basilar membrane can resolve those harmonics. They are more distant from each other, and they're crossing a critical band, where a critical band is something like, if it's less than 1/3 of an octave away, we're within the critical band. And so if you remember our harmonics of something like 2 to 1 or 3 to 2, we're going to have more overlapping harmonics. If we have something like a perfect sixth or a seventh between a C and a B, they're going to be more than 1/3 of an octave away, and we're going to see we go across the critical band. But if we're within that critical band and we're basically out of phase with each other, which I'm trying to show, I stole this from a website, the top right figure, as we start out with these two very similar and yet different harmonics, or these different waveforms, that if they start out in phase and they're slightly different from each other, though, they're going to become more and more out of phase. And there's a point where the basilar membrane cannot resolve those harmonics. And so we might say they get rough, or they get mushy in our ability to resolve them. And so that is another idea of why we hear those sounds as dissonant, as they're not being truly resolved from each other clearly on the basilar membrane. They're not going across that critical band that allows the basilar membrane to resolve them. And so if you're like me, you're stuck in this situation of, so how do we disentangle harmonicity and the overlap or alignment of those harmonics from beating and roughness, and why are we perceiving consonance or dissonance, or is it just both things because they are so confounded? Well, in a very clever study, in my opinion, McDermott, Lair, and Oxenham in 2010 had people come in. They were either musically trained or not musically trained. I'm actually going to ignore the musical training. And they had those people, those participants, rate their preferences for variations in beating, but not harmonics. So where they played the similar harmonics and what would be similar beating, but they would play the two tones to the two different ears. And remember, what's happening, what is causing beating is what is happening at the level, the sensory level, at the basilar membrane. So the two different tones are going to two different basilar membranes. So variations in beating, but not harmonics. Variations in harmonicity, but not beating. So if you remember, there is the critical bandwidth. So if it's less than 1/3 of an octave, that's where we really get the beating, that the basilar membrane isn't resolving those harmonics, and those rapid amplitude fluctuations are causing this roughness with each other. And so, but we can have we can have harmonics that cross that critical bandwidth, but that don't overlap a whole lot. So we're looking at variations in harmonicity, but they're across the critical bandwidth. So some they either align or don't align harmonically, but we don't see differences in beating because we're across that bandwidth. And then they also had those people rate their preferences for consonant versus dissonant tones. Some people prefer consonant tones very strongly, and some people don't have such a strong preference. In fact, at some point, I do hope that we get to talk about whether people like metal music, for example. We see that a lot of people, when they listen to metal music, their heart rate and blood pressure, galvanic skin response, they all increase. But for people who like metal music, those things don't happen. I often talk about it as my anti-meditation music. So I really enjoy Modest Mouse and the Pixies and these bands that really use dissonance in a way that I find very comforting, and I enjoy a whole lot, but that other people just can't even listen to it because of the cacophony that's occurring in their with the music. But McDermott, Lair, and Oxenham had these particular variations. They had people rate their consonant versus dissonant preferences, and then they looked for the relationships between those things. Is there a correlation between whether or not you prefer beating versus not beating, or the variations in the beating? How does that relate with consonance and dissonance preferences, and variations in harmonicity, those overlap of harmonics? How does that relate with consonant dissonant preferences? And if we look at the results, they found a correlation between people preferring harmonicity and their preference for consonants. So clearly the alignment of the harmonics has a great deal to do with whether we're perceiving something as consonant or dissonant. And these preferences were actually stronger for people with musical training. They found no correlation between, or no relationship between, the dislike of beating and the preference for consonants. So when they varied just the beating and kept the harmonics the same across conditions, that was not related to preference for consonants. So it looks like it really has more to do with the harmonicity and the alignment, or the overlap of those harmonics. Now, is that something that is learned? Is this truly sensory, consonance and dissonance, or is this verging on and related to musical consonance and dissonance? It's not completely clear. We know that even infants prefer consonant tones over dissonant tones, but they haven't done this kind of study for infants. So where, if I can say this right, where this gets disentangled in our preferences as we are exposed to music, it's not completely clear. And I'm just going to repeat here that another reason for this perception of consonance or dissonance is really based on our lifetime of experience, so the enculturation of particular kinds of music and what we are familiar with, but that is really referring to musical consonance and dissonance, and it is very difficult to disentangle sensory consonance and dissonance from musical consonance and dissonance, but as I think I've shown before, and talking about the infant study, we're still kind of working on that. They're very confounded as music, not just in Western culture, but in most cultures, it tends to use sensory consonance and dissonance as part of its creation. If we go back to our outline, I'm going to skip tuning systems for now. Maybe for good, but maybe not. It depends on how relevant they become. And really together, I'm going to talk about sensitivity to pitch and then models of pitch perception. Some of the aspects of our sensitivity to pitch that are important to think about is one, that typically what we think about as what we understand of pitch is really relative pitch. So melodies where we have a context for a particular pitch and whether or not it fits within a particular melody. Very few people, so there is this absolute pitch. Can you tell if someone is singing the middle C on a piano, or can you tell that it is a middle C on the piano? Very few people have that kind of perfect pitch, and we will talk about that, I think, when we talk about the brain and musical experience. But most of us think about relative pitch as being really important, where we're sensitive to these pitch relations. And I'm going to skip over the middle there and go, really, pitch forms the basis of melody. So if I'm singing 3 blind mice, 3 blind mice. See how they run, see how they run. Those changing relative pitches give us the melody, and somebody could sing that at a higher, an alto, someone could sing that at a bass. People could sing that very differently from me, but because the relative pitches are maintaining their relationship with each other, we recognize the melody and this kind of melody schemata that we have in our long-term knowledge. Hopefully most of you know that song. Pitch is also very much related to harmony when we are trying to harmonize and when we talk about those harmonics, but even people or chords trying to harmonize or people trying to harmonize with each other, they are basing those harmonies on relative pitch and, of course, whether or not those harmonics are consonant and are overlapping with each other or aligning with each other. And pitch is an important part of key when we talk about musical key. He gives us the example, your author gives us the example of synesthetes. So he gives the example of a Luria, Tsvetkova, and Futer. I only really know A.R. Luria, who has done a lot of work with looking at people with particular brain damage or brain differences, and over the late 19th, early mid-20th century. But they give the example of synesthetes, where some synesthetes, so if you know what synesthesia is, it is this experience of you hear a particular sound and you see a particular color, or you have another experience in a different sensory modality as you are pulling together these sensory modalities, as it's often discussed as. And oftentimes synesthetes are, they respond to particular timbres, so the violin or the piano or some particular sound of a particular instrument. They often respond to particular vowel sounds like a, e, a, o, u, which are going to have some relative frequency or pitch relationships in there. So when I'm going had, I might have a different overall pitch than somebody else, but those pitch relationships, those formant frequencies, they're going to be really similar for me as for someone who has a higher pitched voice or someone who has a lower pitched voice. So typically we see synesthetes as responding to something else than just absolute pitch, but in this particular article they give some examples of people who have specific experiences with particular pitches at particular loudnesses. So I'm going to actually read this. When presented with a 64 decibel, so particular loudness, tone pitched at 250 hertz, he saw a velvet cord with fibers jutting out on all sides. So he had this particular sight sensation. When presented with a 100 decibel tone pitched at 500 hertz, so twice as high a pitch, he saw a streak of lightning that split the sky in two. So we do see synesthetes who respond to absolute pitch. And a lot of those synesthetes we see have a kind of perfect pitch as they respond to, in that way, absolute pitch, which is interesting in and of itself and says a lot about how the brain is responding to pitch and people's sensitivity to pitch. Even though most of us, I can't tell you exactly what an A or a middle C on a piano is, especially since my piano is out of tune and it doesn't sound like a middle C anymore. I don't know what it sounds like anymore. So pitch gives us this really multi-dimensional understanding of structure, and those relative pitches are changing throughout time. One of the models of pitch perception, or most models of pitch perception, includes some understanding that pitch height is very important. Tones that are close in pitch are considered more similar than tones that are separated by greater pitch distances. So a perfect fifth, even though it is less consonant, right, than an playing an octave, which has that 2-to-1 ratio, we rate the perfect fifth, the C and the G, as being more similar than the C and the C that's above it, than a C that's an octave away, because of this distance in pitch. So pitch height is very important for understanding music in a multidimensional way. And we also see, as I keep bringing up, a difference in response on the basilar membrane. So where lower frequencies, which relate to lower pitches, are going to have more influence on the apex, the farthest away, that little center part of the basilar membrane, and higher frequencies are going to have more influence, or there's going to be more response on the basilar membrane at the base, at the very beginning of where near the oval window. So I'm going to go through two of the sort of more well-known models of pitch perception. There are many different models, and they try to take into account different things like our affinity, or the fact that we really like these perfect fifths or major thirds and things like that. But I think the two most, well-known and sort of simple to talk about, one comes from Shepard. So clearly we know that pitch height is very important, and I was just talking about that with sensitivity to pitch, that we are going to rate something like C, we're going to rate it as more similar to D or to E if those are just the 2 or 4 semitones away. Then we are going to rate that to the next octave higher C, even though there's something really similar about those similar tone chroma, the two C's that share that name, but pitch height is kind of where we, at least in our explicit kind of memory, what we would call similar. Pitch height is how we rate those things. So in Shepard's model, he discusses both pitch height, and you can see over to the right this pitch class circle that I tried to somewhat recreate from something from online, where those curvy arrows are supposed to be showing that if we're going clockwise, we're really ascending along that monotonic arc, if you will. And then if we're going counterclockwise, we're going to be descending, again, along the same really similar tonal series. But we are ascending or descending in height. And then there is this real similarity. If we look to the left, this helical model by Shepard, there is a real similarity as we're moving up through that helix of especially octaves of C sounding more pleasant with the next C, the octave higher C, and the next octave higher C, and that it's really across from that F sharp. So what we called before the devil's chord, the tritone, that those are more dissimilar from each other in many ways, and that's kind of where we get the sounds of what's consonant or dissonant. So this PowerPoint finishes, I'm going to suggest that you go and watch the Shepard's illusion. David Huron discusses Shepard's illusion, but I'm just going to let you see what it sounds like, and partly why we want to include really both pitch height and pitch chroma. So keeping the same, when we have something of the same note name, like the A, the low A, the mid A, as we're moving up through the A's, those A's all have the same tone chroma, that there is something that's important to our perception of pitch. So something that you're going to see in that short video, and something that is, again, it comes up in many of these models of pitch perception, not as clearly in Shepard's explicit model, but it's very clear when you see his illusion that he discovered, but is the dependence upon context. And so another model of pitch perception that is pretty well known at this point comes from Carol Krumhansel and her colleagues, where it really, one of the things that's important as far as context is the established key. And so in this study by Krumhansel and Kessler, which is a pretty seminal study at this point back in 1982, they did this. This is giving an example of C major, but this is actually averaged across many different keys. And so they would establish the key either by playing a scale or some arpeggio or something that would clearly establish the key for people, and then they would have people rate. Now we're just going to play the tone C. How does that sound? Well, in the key of C major, C is what we call tonic. It is the name of the key, and people rate that as the highest. You'll notice what they're also rating as very high or relatively high, as far as like what sounds. So they're rating what sounds good to them given the context or given really the established key. You can see that people like the tone E and they like the tone G next as the next best after the tonic, and those are of course the major third and the perfect fifth. As we stay within the key, so C, in the key of C, it's C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. All of those tones are rated higher than any of the non-diatonic tones. So any of the tones that do not fall in that key. So C sharp, D sharp, F sharp, G sharp, and A sharp, those all tend to sound relatively bad, and they have the lowest ratings. So in this case, one of the contexts that they see as being particularly important as far as pitch perception goes is the established key. And of course, a lot of this is, again, going to be based on experience. And in fact, there's a study that your author gives us by Oram and Cuddy in 1995, where they established just frequencies of certain notes or tones, and then what tones you can expect. So giving something now starting you in a completely unfamiliar, so not Western music, established keys that we've all really had a lot of experience with, whether it's implicit or explicit, we have. So starting with a completely unfamiliar group of tones that people will start to rate sort of the expected tones, the tones that they hear with the established tones, if that makes sense. Now in this really unfamiliar, in this new context, we learn that very quickly. So how much of this is really innate, how much of this is learned, is still one of the questions of pitch perception. It does look like we have some sensitivity to absolute pitch, that we tend to have some memory of the absolute pitch of, they've used television program tunes or happy birthday, that's something that we've heard relatively often, and in a particular, starting with a particular pitch, we like it better starting at that pitch, and when we sing it ourselves, we tend to start at a pitch that is familiar to us. So there's some measure of our sensitivity to absolute pitch, but most of our pitch perception is relative pitch. It's relative to what we're hearing. There's a lot of pieces and parts to that, as dependent on context of the established key, the song we're listening to, the song that we're familiar with, our background knowledge, and all of that. Okay, so I want a very short wrap up until next time. So do go look at Shepard's Illusion at this Vimeo.com link. I found this really mind-blowing. I shared it with family. I've listened to it, watched it several times in this kind of disbelief. This last summer was the first time I'd really looked into that particular model of pitch perception, and the illusion is quite astounding. Next time we will talk about why why we have music, why are we musical, what is the maybe evolutionary purpose or social bonding purpose, why do we have music. And I'm hoping that you all do your reading and come to class planning to debate the topic, whether you're on the side of the paper you read or not, to just have some thoughts and opinions. It's not a real debate, but just to really to discuss the topic, but with several different possibilities being represented.